Former Jewish members had lived through the horror of the Jewish rebellion against Rome, AD 66 to 70, and may have even seen the sacred vessels of the temple paraded in triumph by the Emperor Titus in his victory procession through the great Roman Forum. A young Christian scribe by the name of Marcos stands up with a collection of papyrus leaves and begins to speak in the ordinary Greek they all understood. This is how it all began. The good news of the Messiah, Jesus, Son of God, as it was written in the book of the prophet Isaiah. Over the next 2 hours, he tells the story of Jesus of Nazareth, from his baptism by John to his death and resurrection. Why did he tell this story now? The community had heard the letter of the Apostle Paul and knew that through the gift of God's grace in Jesus, Jew and Gentile without distinction were redeemed from sin and death, and that Jesus had died for the ungodly, as Paul said. This described their former lives. They had heard some stories of Jesus as they were recited at liturgy and in the preaching of the missionaries and apostles. Yet their world was collapsing around them, and they yearned for a new center to their lives. And Mark offered his good news as a way to keep the memory and presence of Jesus alive, little aware that wherever Christians would gather, his story would be told and retold. The fundamental importance of Mark, and of all the Gospels, is that they present a narrative of Jesus as the truly human one, who lived in a particular place and manifested the presence of God in a human life. Doctrine is not enough for Christians. Christians must relate to a person, and that person comes alive for us first in the narrative of his life as given in the Gospel of Mark. This has been eloquently stated by John Sobrino, the liberation theologian from El Salvador, who has written powerfully about the meaning of the life of Jesus. Sobrino says, "Whenever in the course of history Christians have sought to reinvest Christ with his totality, they will have to return to Jesus of Nazareth." Yet a decade or so later, Mark's story is again retold by Matthew and Luke. Matthew takes over 90% of Mark, and in the subsequent centuries it is Matthew that is read and commented on. St. Augustine of Hippo summarized much of the positions of the early church fathers when he called Mark the lackey and the summarizer of Matthew. The first extant commentary on Mark is by Venerable Bede in the 8th century. One contemporary author has called it the orphan gospel. Mark slept quietly in the shadow of Matthew into the rise of modern biblical criticism in the 19th century, when it was argued that Mark was the earliest gospel and the one closest to authentic traditions of Jesus. In the last 150 years, the Gospel of Mark has been recognized as a treasured independent source for understanding early Christian theology and history. In any given year, the published books on Mark are far larger than the whole Bible. Each of the Gospel writers, while handing on fundamental truths of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, had access to traditions that the others lacked, and also offered their own distinct portraits of Jesus. There may, as the letter to the Ephesians say, be one Lord, one faith, and one baptism, but in the Gospels there are 4 different portrayals of Jesus, and at least 4 different ways of responding to his life and teaching. One of the reasons for the appeal of Mark is that it offers a Christianity stripped down to its bare essentials: hearing the word, faith, following of Jesus, the mystery of the cross, the Eucharistic banquet, and the proclamation, he has been raised up. If we only had Mark, there would be no Christmas stories to tell, no parables that have so defined Jesus. For example, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the widow, and the judge. Christians would not pray the Lord's Prayer. There would be no Sermon on the Mount. There would be no stories of Jesus appearing to anyone after